this working?
Yeah, it should work fine.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not used to being microphoned in this way. So thank you all so much for coming tonight. We have here our panel that you know, Ambassador Navdeep Suri, and also Justin Rowalatt, the BBC South Asia correspondent. We're very happy to have you all here today, and I think the format for the evening will have a discussion between the three of us, and we'll ask you to hold your questions until the end, where we can have a Q&A and then a reception and a book signing. So I think, Ambassador Suri, the first thing you have to tell us is how the manuscript came to be, how it came into your hands, and how the entire publication of the book arose.
I think I have to thank good luck and perseverance from my father, because the book, when it was first published in May 1920, was soon thereafter banned by the British, and all copies were confiscated. And for the next 60 years in our family, we just knew that our grandfather had written Khooni Vaisakhi, but nobody had actually seen it. And there was a passing reference to it in my grandfather's autobiography, which was first published in 1949, speaking about Khooni Vaisakhi, but that was about it. My father kept looking for it, and in 1979, 1980, there were two coincidents that took place. The first was, there's a professor of Punjabi language in a college in Amritsar, Dr. Gupta. He had written an article in a literary magazine called Jagriti, which spoke of my grandfather, Nanak Singh, as a poet rather than as the novelist that he was known as. And in that article, he made extensive references to Khooni Vaisakhi. My father came across that article and immediately saw something amiss. How does this man know so much about Khooni Vaisakhi when nobody has actually seen it? So he called the editor, got Dr. Gupta's address. My mother and he then went off in search of Dr. Gupta, went and met him, and they asked him, how is it that you wrote? And Dr. Gupta then had his story, that his grandfather was an avid collector of books and manuscripts and pamphlets and everything. And he perhaps had picked up this soon after it had been released. And many years later, when Dr. Gupta moved residence, he found gunny sacks full of these old pamphlets. And sifting through them, he came across this old manuscript. Being a professor of Punjabi, he immediately knew that this was something rare that he had in his hands, and proceeded to write that article. Mm. So at least that is one particularly interesting strand.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So this poem is actually a very, very moving account, of course, of the Amritsar massacre. So I thought, just to inform the audience, maybe, Justin, you could give us the historical context that we need to really understand the text.
So let's do it together, Navdeep, because we have we have a very unusual family bond. My great-grandfather wrote the act that was the legal act that was that in a way precipitated the massacre, in that the people originally were demonstrating against the rather draconian
Rowlatt Act.
The Rowlatt Act, the Black Acts, Gandhi called them, that my great-grandfather wrote. And of course, your grandfather was in the garden at Jallianwala Bagh when the massacre took place. So it happened on the 13th of April, 1919. It was after a series of conflicts that there'd been demonstrations in Amritsar. There'd been some British people had been killed, also some Indians killed. The British were upset about the Brits who'd been killed, and there was a meeting. The guy who'd come to take over military operations in Amritsar, General Dyer, issued a proclamation and order that there'd be no more meetings. It wasn't done very thoroughly, and the meeting in Jallianwala Bagh, which is a walled garden in the center of Amritsar, went ahead. About 20,000 people. All the figures are disputed. 15 or 20,000 people there in the afternoon of the 13th of April. And the general heard that this meeting was taking place and proceeded with 50 troops through Amritsar and got to the entrance to the garden, which is actually a narrow pass path. He had 2 armoured cars with machine guns on them. He couldn't get, thank God, couldn't get the machine guns in, but went in with the troops and immediately opened fire. It was his belief that the whole of the Punjab was rising up against the British. It was a mutiny happening all over again, huge rebellion, and he decided he needed what, with hindsight, we would call exemplary punishment. He needed something that would be so big that would demonstrate British power and subdue what was happening in Amritsar, and therefore opened fire, fired 1,650 bullets or something over the course of 10 minutes. Again, the figures are disputed. The British say 379 people were killed. I think the more realistic estimate is much more like 500 or 600 at least, and 3 times that wounded. And you may ask yourself why, if they only shot 1,600 bullets, do kind of respectable estimates put the number of total casualties at something like 2,000 people? It's because the people were so packed into the garden, there was no escape. The exits where the crowds were locked, and they fired into the thick of the crowd. They were firing with the intention of killing people. And so the bullets maybe passed through 1 or 2 people. And of course, there was a stampede as well when the firing began, and many people died in the stampede.
And these are those Lee Enfield rifles that are pretty powerful.
So they're high-velocity rifles designed for battlefields, and so they're very powerful weapons. But the crucial thing, really, in terms of Indian history, is that it was a pivotal moment for the nationalist movement. Gandhi had begun his first non-violent protest, Satyagraha, is that right?
That's right.
His first was a Rowlatt Satyagraha. His first, he called it the Rowlatt Satyagraha, and it was a series of demonstrations against the Rowlatt Act throughout India. And Gandhi, who'd been a marginal political leader before that, the nationalist movement was led by great figures from the Congress Party, and he was considered a bit of an upstart. It actually made him into a huge national figure, the massacre, and transformed the nationalist movement into something that both Hindus and Muslims could come behind in opposition to not just the Rowlatt Acts, but obviously the massacre at Amritsar. So it was a kind of watershed, really, I think you'd agree, for the independence movement as well.
And also the other things like Rabindranath Tagore, who had been knighted by the British and had received the Nobel Prize for Literature, saw this as such an egregious act that he renounced his knighthood. And that again sent a wave through the country that this poet laureate was renouncing his knighthood. And there's a very passionate letter that he wrote.
He wrote a fantastic letter. Even Winston Churchill, who was, I think it's fair to say, a terrible racist, but even Winston Churchill spoke out and said that, Amritsar was a stain on the history of the empire. One of many, you probably argue, but even Churchill thought it was, unconscionable that the British had behaved in such a way, and that it made, we were talking about it earlier. Churchill felt it brought Britain to the level of infused with race. But the level of the Bolsheviks or the Germans, he said, when we try and criticize what the Bolsheviks are doing or what the Germans are doing, they will say, well, look at how you behave in India, look at Amritsar, and you will see that you are the same. So they felt that there was now a moral equivalence. The British had thought this great tradition of British exceptionalism, where we felt that the way that we administered the empire was somehow different from, for example, the Belgians in the Congo or, German Empire. We felt that we kind of did it in a more civilized way. And I think Churchill felt that was called into question by the behavior of Amritsar. So it was a kind of moment of great kind of national torment for Britain, but obviously much more so for India.
So Nanak Singh was a young man. Maybe you can tell us the story of his survival of the Amritsar massacre, which, as you say, became a kind of family folklore that he himself never spoke about.
Yeah, and that's one of the oddest things about this, that most of what we know is stuff that we heard from our grandmother. I was only 12 when our grandfather passed away, but there was the family folklore about him having gone to the Bagh with 2 of his friends, getting trapped inside when the firing started. Both his friends died. He himself, in the stampede, was knocked unconscious, lost part of his hearing in that incident, and was left for dead, and walked away from there. And some months later, wrote this long poem, Khooni Vaisakhi. When I was doing some research on this and asking my uncles, and I'm delighted that my uncle Kulbir Singh and my aunt are here with us from Amritsar, when I was doing some research into it, really trying to find out more about his own first-hand impressions, apart from Khooni Vaisakhi and some reference in his autobiography, there's nothing, and it's almost like he had closed that window, that this was a subject that he did not wish to talk about. And to try and understand that further, I spoke with one of her friends who's into psychology and so on, and she said, this is not unusual that when you face such a traumatic event, there's a part of you that no longer wishes to speak about it.
So, Justin, you actually wrote a companion piece for this volume. And this piece is entitled The Sins of the Great-Grandfather. And it's actually inspired by your visit to Amritsar and your visit to Jallianwala Bagh specifically. So can you tell us a little bit about that experience of going back there?
Well, prompted also by Navdeep, who phoned me up, and I'd written some stuff for the BBC and done some radio reports kind of reflecting on my family's role in all of this and how it felt to be a correspondent in India at a time when India was thinking a lot about the massacre and a lot about the kind of that period of history and obviously my great-grandfather's role in it. And Navdeep phoned me and said, hey, why don't you write a piece? And I actually thought it was lovely to be able to kind of, it was an excuse really to kind of research more deeply and write something longer and more considered than you can normally in journalism. So no, it was a wonderful opportunity to kind of think through. I mean, my family's, you know, Navdeep, you have a direct connection, obviously, and with your grandfather. I never knew my great-grandfather. He was a kind of distant figure. My father kind of, you know, didn't reflect much on family history, so I knew that, we vaguely knew that there was this kind of, you know, bit of unpleasant history in our background. And I remember the first time I became aware of it really was when the movie Gandhi came out. And my family, we went to just after it had been released, we went to Leicester Square in London, the big cinemas, you know, when the films first get released. And we all sat there, the whole family. I've got 3 sisters and me and my parents, and watched this film, knowing that, and this awful moment, watching the massacre and realizing that there's a direct connection with it. But the really visceral connection came when I went to Amritsar for the first time and into Jallianwala Bagh and was led around by S.K. Mukherjee, who's the guy who runs the Jallianwala Bagh Trust that manages. It was bought, I think, in 1920, yes, as you know, to stop it being redeveloped, really, because I think the British would quite happily have, you know, built something on it because it was such a kind of stain on the British record in India. But it was preserved. I think at Gandhi's initiative, he said, so anyway, this guy S.K. Mukherjee now manages the trust, and he took me around, and I found it incredibly moving to go around, which I think, and I got quite upset. I mean, I you know, became very emotional and cried, and he said that was actually really common. He said it's common, very common among Indians who come and visit, but also actually many British people who come feel overwhelmed by the emotion when they go there. And I think, you know, one of the striking things is how you know, obvious it is when you go there that there's no escape, yes, and how, you know, how it's clear that Dyer, the general in charge, you know, when it was, it's described in literature as shooting fish in a barrel. It was, you know, there was no escape. These were unarmed, peaceful protesters who'd unwittingly were involved in breaching this new regulation that he promulgated that morning. And he, you know, there was no escape. I mean, it's, you know, horrific to an extent that is, yeah, is shocking. And I think anyone going would find it moving, but particularly when you feel a sense of family responsibility, I found it quite, yeah, very, very moving indeed.
Well, since you've said that, I have to ask you, of course, about this question of personal responsibility. Of course, there's a constant discussion about an apology for the massacre. I wonder if you want to...
Well, and Navdeep as well. I wonder what your opinions are, whether I need to... I mean, it's quite interesting. Actually, I said when I was there, I did a radio piece for Radio 4, the main radio station in the UK, the morning programme, the Today programme, and they decided, you know, it was very, very long for the programme. Normally they're like 3 minutes long, and we did a 10-minute piece in which, you know, I went back and I, you know, kind of unthinkingly recorded something, and I kind of apologized. And I think personally I could make an apology, but I prompted my uncle. I'd love to be able to find it actually, but my uncle wrote me this, wrote this incredible email criticizing me, saying, traduced the family name, libeled the country. It was really, really extravagant. Navdeep, at one point it was included in the essay, and then out of respect for poor Uncle Richard, who's 82, and it's like he's a bit of an Edwardian himself. But he said, you've perpetrated a myth based on a blood libel, on Gandhi's blood libel, is his words.
Wow.
That his grandfather, my great-grandfather, was responsible for the massacre. And it was historically utterly false. Uncle Richard had no position. But it was extraordinary to see the kind of conflict
in your own family.
Within the family, within the family, just a generation difference. And I then tried to talk to him. He came last year, so the 99th anniversary. He went and he came and stayed with us when we were living in Delhi. And even then, he still would defend. He felt that, because law had broken down, it was a defense of law and therefore was justifiable. We can come to that. Wow. I don't feel personally responsible. I don't know what people in the audience would feel about that. I don't feel personally responsible. Navdeep, do you blame me?
I don't blame you at all. I think as a diplomat, I shouldn't comment on this, but in a personal capacity, what I want to say is that there isn't much joy in an apology that is wrenched out of somebody. An apology should be voluntary. It should be coming from within you. And I think that at some point, the Britons, to redeem their own name, should do a kind of an apology for sins previously committed.
Yeah, you see, I agree with that. I think there's, and I think the reluctance, there clearly is, the British feel terribly, terribly, conflicted about Amritsar. They're horribly embarrassed. They realise it's a, terrible, terrible thing. And you see David Cameron, they come so close to apologising, but they never quite do. And I think partly there's a kind of political aspect to this, which is if Britain apologises for Amritsar, where does it stop? Where does it stop? And many more people were killed in massacres during what Britain still calls the Indian Mutiny, which Indians call the First War of Independence. Or
the Bengal famine, in which 3 million people were killed.
Exactly. But then you've got the Mau Mau, you've got Ireland. It goes on and on and on, and the list is endless. So I think that Britain has I think they must have thought very deeply in government about this, and they've decided that you can't apologise for individual massacres when you've got such there's such a roll call of alternatives. So I think what Britain needs to do is kind of come to terms with its history in a more, it needs to engage with its own history and its responsibility more generally for imperial crimes and imperialism in general. And so I think you're right. It has to come from the heart, and there needs to be a discussion within Britain about this, which isn't happening now. And we kind of rather hope that this year, the 100th anniversary of Amritsar, which is such a powerful symbol of British imperialism, would be the focus for debate. But we're too caught up in Brexit, I think, to think about anything else.
Yeah, well, on Brexit, of course, the comment in India was...
Don't talk about Brexit, come on.
Was that we know from experience that Brits take a very long time to leave.
So maybe let's go back to the story of Nanak Singh, and you can tell us, because people may also not know his status in Punjabi as literally the father of the Punjabi novel, and this is just a really crucial piece in terms of filling out his oeuvre, which is actually really unknown in English, in fact.
Right. So he was only 22 when Khooni Vaisakhi happened, and when he wrote this poem. And this was really his second substantive work. He had previously done a religious poem in praise of the Sikh gurus, which had been a runaway bestseller. But it's funny that thereafter, a year later, he was in jail for protesting against another act of the Britons, which was controlling the Sikh gurudwaras, the Sikh shrines. And in jail, he met this person who had a large body of novels of Munshi Premchand, a very eminent Hindi writer of that time. And he read those and realized that this was really to be his calling in life, to write novels which would reform society, which would bring out the ills of society. And he started writing his very first novel while he was still in jail, and lost it because the jailers came and raided the cell, and the manuscript was destroyed. But after he came out of jail, he wrote one more piece of poetry which was called Zakhmi Dil, which literally means a wounded heart, which is a very clever piece of literature because it uses fables to drive home the message of British sort of perfidy or whatever you like. But thereafter, he wrote in 1924, he wrote his first novel. And for the next, 50 odd years, he wrote a book every year. And he produced this immense body of work, something like 36 novels, pieces of theater, pieces of poetry, and so on. And really created a tradition of the secular fiction in Punjabi literature, which was not existing until he came on the scene. Kind of in the sense of Thomas Hardy, perhaps, or people like that in English literature, or Munshi Premchand in Hindi literature. For that, he won the Sahitya Akademi Award in 1962 when President Radhakrishnan was the president. And in Punjabi, and this is part of the tragedy in India, that, you know, in our family we often say, and I've heard critics say, that he was such a great storyteller that had he written in a language more widely spoken than Punjabi, he could have been perhaps an international figure. But given the fact that Punjabi is such a limited, especially the written form of Punjabi is such a limited community, he didn't really gain currency beyond. But in Punjab itself, most of his books are still in their 30th, 40th reprint. Many of his books are classics in that sense that if you are in high school, college, university, they are mandatory reading for you. They're part of your syllabus. So, you know, there is that aspect about him.
But one of the interesting things about the poem is that he's brought some of those literary devices into the poem, hasn't he? It's told almost like a thriller. You know, you want to keep reading. Tell us a bit about that. Because,
but you know, so even though he wrote novels which were social dramas or aimed at reforming society through voices of his characters, there was this unputdownable quality about them. And so what he does in this, and you can see sort of early signs of that thing of a storyteller in this poem, because many of his short pieces end up with leading you forward into the next section. For example, the fate of Amritsar, right? This is on the day after the protests. And he says, scenes like these from village and town played out too in our city sublime. Rowlatt's passage that fateful day numbed every heart. It was a crime. A loss so foul it seemed unreal. Faces ashen, shocked by new paradigm. Says Nanak Singh, and that's the device he uses. Says Nanak Singh, let's move on a pace of events unfolding one at a time.
There's also a feature that he uses where he periodically returns to sections called the poet's thoughts. And I found these sections incredibly moving, where in fact the poet inserts himself into the historical story of the narrative. And he does this also by kind of reiterating the phrase, my friends. So for example, he'll say, like a bird that barely left its nest, by slingshot is brought down, my friends. Says Nanak Singh, you can't fight fate. God himself is playing with you, my friends. And there's an incredibly moving quality to the narrative because of this repetition.
Yeah.
So maybe you can tell us about your process of translation.
So it's almost like there is a third person, first person going back and forth, right? That he is, in some passages, the witness, and in other passages, the commentator. And it's interesting to see how he moves back and forth between those roles. And in a sense, it starts from well, you know, there's a particular section which is still before the massacre, but after the April 10th killing on the railway bridge in Amritsar, and it says. And this is as people are going to gather in Jallianwala Bagh the next day. O God, these innocent men taken to killing fields by providence, no place to run, nowhere to hide, feet shackled by lurking death intents. Crouch low, keep your heads near the ground, for dire's coming, and there's no defense. And then it goes on to say, says Nanak Singh must paint the picture of the massacre brutal with my pen. So, you know, again, he's kind of leading you to what happens next.
We actually have a really beautiful rendition of a section of this poem in song. So maybe we can actually listen to a moment of that, and I can ask you to comment on it.
अजे लफ्ज तदबीर मुंह विच है सी उधर फौज ने धूड़ तुमा दिती थोड़ी देर पिछे फौज गोरखे दी जनरल डायर ने अगां वधा दिती मिंटां विच ही कई हजार गोली उन्हां ज़ालिमां खत्म करा दिती मिंटां विच ही कई हजार गोली उन्हां ज़ालिमां खत्म करा दिती पल विच ही लोथां दे ढेर लग गए कोई सके न मूल पछाण उथे गिनती सिखां दी बहुत ही नजर आवे भावें बहुत हिंदू मुसलमान उथे गिनती सिखां दी बहुत ही नजर आवे भावें बहुत हिंदू मुसलमान उथे सोने सुर में छैल छबिलड़े जी हाय तड़फ दे शेर जवान उथे नानक सिंह न पुछदा बात कोई नानक सिंह न पुछदा बात कोई राखा उन्हां दा एक भगवान उथे
I wanted the audience to really get a sense of the lyricism of the Punjabi. This is really a very difficult thing that you've done, but you've also become a translator in your own right now after all this time. So maybe you can tell us about how you dealt with some of the problems of translation.
You know, I'd previously thought I was incapable of translating poetry. I'd translated 2 of my grandfather's novels. They were obviously prose, and that worked reasonably well. When I decided that we wanted to do this in time for the centenary, and the first challenge really was that when you translate verse into verse, and in a lot of the poem, our grandfather keeps the AB kind of rhythm. So every second, fourth, sixth, eighth lines, they tend to rhyme with each other. So the challenge was, can you capture that cadence even while staying true to the text? Initially, I thought it wasn't possible because my first draft that I did was really free verse. And a lot of advice I was getting from friends who know more about this than I do was that the content is king, content is more important, focus on that, and the rhyme and all is okay. I wasn't quite satisfied with that, and somewhere Robert Frost's somewhat intemperate comment that to translate into free verse is a bit like playing tennis without a net. You can do it, but it's not fair. That stuck in my head, and I read up a little bit more on the different aspects of translation and convinced myself that it had to be in rhyme, it had to capture the rhythm. And when I committed myself to that, only then I realized that I had also grown my challenge by a few times. Because what you suddenly realize is that the universe of vocabulary available to you has shrunk by 95%. And now you are stuck with trying to rhyme the second, fourth, sixth, and eighth lines and still capturing the same thought. So I think it turned out to be a pretty rigorous intellectual process for me, and certainly a break from my usual run-of-the-mill work.
I mean, translation is a kind of mediation, and what you are talking about is a process between languages, but it's also a process between cultures, between histories, and all of these things. So I don't know, Justin, if you want to, this is something kind of akin to the work that you have also done, even as a journalist.
You mean kind of bridging, interpreting cultures a little bit? I'm not sure if it's but I'm meeting the challenge of making it rhyme while carrying the meaning, I think, is more complex than trying to report India to the world, which is quite a challenging process, I have to say. No, I think you've done extremely well. I think because it really feels like genuine poetry, which must be the challenge of translating a poem. I think you're right to heed Frost and do the difficult thing.
So, for example, the words that you just heard, that's a very young singer called Harpreet, and I requested him that would you put some of these verses into music and let's see what it sounds like. And when we tried this in Delhi, half the audience had tears in their eyes. The lyricism and the music and the words are so powerful. I wanted to give those of you who don't understand Punjabi a sense of the passage and what it really says in the translation. So this is the scene when General Dyer has arrived in the Bagh. So it starts with this, and bear with me because this is a little bit long. 5:30 sharp the clock had struck. Thousands gathered in the Bagh, my friends. Leaders came to lament the nation's woes, taking turns to speak out loud, my friends. Voiced grievance, hardship, anger, sorrow, saying no one listens to us, my friends. What can we do? What options left? Can't see any ray of light, my friends. Those words forlorn, they barely voiced, came soldiers thundering down, my friends. At Dyer's command, those Gurkha troops gathered in a formation tight, my friends. Under tyrants' orders, they opened fire straight into innocent hearts, my friends. And fire and fire and fire they did. Some thousands of bullets were shot, my friends. Like searing hail, they felled our youth, a tempest not seen before, my friends. Riddled chests and bodies slid to the ground, each one a target large, my friends. Haunting cries for help did rend the sky. Smoke rose from smoldering guns, my friends. Just a sip of water was all they sought. Valiant youth lay dying in the dust, my friends. That narrow lane to enter the Bagh, sealed off on Dyer's command, my friends. No exit, no escape, no way out was left, making Bagh a deathly trap, my friends. A fortunate few somehow survived, while most died then and there, my friends. Some ran with bullets ripping their chest, stumbling to their painful end, my friends. Others caught the bullet while running away, dropping lifeless in awkward heaps, my friends. In minutes, the bags were strewn with corpses. None knew just who was who, my friends. Many of them did look like Sikhs. Amid Hindus and Muslims, plenty, my friends. In the prime of their youth, our brave hearts lay, gasping for one last breath, my friends. Long hair lay matted in blood and grime. In slumber deep they sleep, my friends. Says Nanak Singh, who knows their state, but God the one and only, my friends.
It's interesting. One of the interesting things about like a centenary, an anniversary like this, is it calls forth, obviously, your inspiration to actually sit down and do the translation. But also there's been some quite interesting new histories of the period. And one of there's a book called Amritsar by a guy called Kim Wagner, he's German, but he works in Britain, British academic. And he looks at the way in which the kind of degree of misunderstanding between the two communities. It's a really fascinating study of the run-up to Amritsar, and very detailed. It's all based in Amritsar. And the degree to which both sides misunderstood each other's intentions. So Dyer genuinely believed that there was an emergency and that there was a rebellion happening, and there were echoes of the mutiny. And he felt that only this, we discussed earlier, this exemplary punishment was necessary. And at the same time, the Indians felt aggrieved by the way in which the British had behaved on the bridge. As you mentioned, there was on the 10th of April, an Indian group came over a bridge into what they call the civil lines, where the Europeans lived, and the British troops thought they were being overwhelmed, and they shot and killed, I think, 3 people on the bridge and wounded others, again with these Lee Enfield rifles. But it's interesting the degree to which both communities were so separate and so unable to understand each other, and in a way that set the path towards this kind of horror that both interpreted. So Dyer, when he justifies what he did, this awful massacre that you've just heard and written about, from, remember, a first-hand witness, when he talks about it, he says, I was about to be overwhelmed. And they say, why did you go on shooting? One of his, I don't know what rank he was, but another soldier said, you've done enough, you should stop. And he said, no, we need to continue. And he said he did that because he felt that the crowd would overwhelm him, and he would be, humiliated. But of course, the crowd was not in the mind for that. The crowd had gone peacefully. And again, this gulf of misunderstanding is quite extraordinary. And, very, very hard to kind of understand today, actually.
In fact, there's one section right in the start of the book where, while the protests are just beginning and Gandhi is given the call for Hartal and so on, which really captures this gulf that between the communities that he's talking about. So if I can just read out a small portion. It says, dispirited and despondent by the turn of events, they lamented aghast at miserable fate. With sinking hearts they then witnessed a shadow spread across a nation great. All comforts and pleasures now sadly gone, leaving gloom and grief to stalk the state. So sad they sound, like the wailing crane, to smile or greet they hesitate. Shops closed and workplaces empty, forlorn and lost in streets they wait. Strikes called in every city and town, sobs muffled they roam in a sorry state. Those valiant sons of Bharat Mata, shedding tears dismayed and desolate. Each tragedy retold, notes get compared, every nook and corner a place to debate. But a scene so different on the other side, friends gather at home to celebrate. A mission accomplished, the act is done. 'Tis time for wine and feast ornate. Their quislings, turncoats, and traitors all come laden with gossip and tales narrate. Rebel, robber, scoundrel, and more, names used against us to aggravate, framing our heroes with guilt and treason, damage the wreak on our nation great. So the contrast between one community that is grieving against the Rowlatt Act and the other which is celebrating, and the way that comes out in the poem itself.
No, it's very beautiful. It's very beautiful.
And also the kind of disconnect between the rebel and he who is treasonous.
Yeah.
And why don't you show us the book?
Well, I thought it'd be interesting to bring it on. This is the way that the Act was passed. The British were very worried about what they called at the time sedition. Indeed, sedition still exists in the Indian kind of legal system. It doesn't exist in Britain anymore. And sedition just means kind of treasonous behaviour. And they were worried because they could see this upsurge of treasonous behaviour happening in India. It was very strong in the Punjab. It was very strong around Calcutta and in Bengal. And so they were very anxious about what they saw as this kind of uncontrolled rebellion that seems to be happening. And so my great-grandfather was asked to go and do an inquiry, a government inquiry into sedition in India. This is in 1917, so before the end of the First World War. And the British were looking ahead, and I think 1.3 million Indians had fought on the side of the British in the First World War. And there was a recognition that there was a kind of inevitability that the British needed to concede some self-government to India. And at the same time, I think the British were thinking, we'll give them some self-government, but things are a bit restive, as they used to say in those days. Things are a bit restive in India. We need to make sure we've got the kind of legal architecture to control things if we do. And in 1915, they passed an act called the Defence of India, which had brought some very, very, it was wartime measures, but brought some very, very tough restrictions on, for example, seditious literature, publishing seditious literature, being involved with groups that supported sedition. Again, that just really means treason. And the idea was that I think the British really were looking for an excuse to, to carry that wartime legislation over into peacetime. And essentially, I think my grandfather, you used the word your grandfather used the word quisling. I think in a way, my grandfather was the quisling who was tasked with doing this, because this is the committee, this is the report of the committee. So he went out in 1917. This was published in 1918. And what's interesting about this is essentially it's a kind of account of all the disturbances and terrorist acts and stuff that have happened across India, but without really any kind of what it's really missing. It's interesting I don't know if you've read it, but when you read this, there's no analysis of what is motivating people to protest against the British. So at no point does he sit and engage with why these people are doing what they're doing, which seems quite extraordinary. But clearly that was, I suspect, part of the British agenda. They didn't want to think too deeply about the rights and wrongs of the nationalist cause, which was why this change, there was this upsurge in kind of rebellious behaviour. And obviously if you don't think about why people are motivated to do what they're doing, you're never going to be able to come up with appropriate legislation. And I think that, history has absolutely proved that, the legislation was wholly inappropriate to the moment, that it completely destroyed the British reputation in India. The anger that, you've just read about, the anger that people felt when the Act was passed, because of course that passage from the poem comes immediately after the Act is passed, and people are furious with what the British are trying to do because it's transparent to the Indians, it's obvious, and in fact I just very vividly brought to mind, I met Tushar Gandhi, who's Mahatma Gandhi's great-grandson, to talk about the role of our great-grandfathers together, my sins and his saintliness. And he was very, very funny. At first I was anxious to meet him. I always thought he might be a little bit kind of, hostile to me. But he greeted me very warmly. And I said, I'm surprised that you're so, friendly. And he said, wow, in a way we have so much to thank your grandfather for. And he said, well, he was responsible for putting the first nail in the coffin of the British Empire, so which is quite a claim. I'm not sure it's entirely true. I think the nails have already been firmly hammered in by then. But he said something very interesting. He said that for his great-grandfather, the Rowlatt Act was really a gift. Yes. He said it really helped his great-grandfather, because he was looking, he knew he needed to unite as the Indians against, and not just Hindus, and the obvious one is Hindus and Muslims, but not just Hindus and Muslims. He had to unite the kind of upper caste Congress leadership, who traditionally had led the nationalist movement, with the people of India, had to engage the entire community of people. And he said, your great-grandfather's legislation was a gift for Gandhi, because he said it was so transparently, manifestly unjust. All Indians could oppose it together. And that's what gave a rocket to the independence movement, because everybody could unite. And then, of course, in a very cynical, and I mean this in a cynical way, the icing on the cake was Amritsar, which became, which was so obviously appalling that, that at that point, people like Tagore said, we cannot deal with people who behave like this. We cannot countenance a kind of settlement with these people. So the modest kind of moves to self-government the British had been talking about became kind of themselves unacceptable. And Indians said, we need full independence now.
And the Congress symbolically held their annual session in Amritsar because of that.
Yes, in 1920, yeah.